um, and am very, very fortunate to have had an opportunity to explore tallgrass prairie as part of my part-time business. I did some prairie consulting, and next slide, had an opportunity to work with some incredible mentors in the middle there. You'll see Doug Ladd and Gerald Wilhelm, who really served as inspiration in so many different ways in understanding the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. And so the work within the tallgrass prairie really made me very interested in exploring and experimenting on how to best get prairie restored. It was a really exciting field for me and still is today. And so next slide, please. My husband and I, back then, my boyfriend, we decided to buy a Iowa farm, and we were going to restore it to tallgrass prairie. We were, we had a lot of ambition and a lot of love, and we were going to put it to work on the land. So this is the parcel that we bought. It's a quarter section. You can see my pointer, I don't believe is working, but to the north, half of the section is the top of the watershed. So if you just go north a half section, that's the top of the watershed coming into these two drainage ways. And when we bought the farm, it was the east side was crop broken out into crop ground, and you can see some really extreme areas that were very, very hilly that couldn't be farmed, that remained in buffer strips. And the west half was a pasture that was being grazed. And you can see, just if you look straight north, you can see there is drainage coming into the farm from the adjacent cropland to the north and to the east. Next slide. So this is what we looked at when we were looking to the west of our farm. Next slide. And we decided it would be important to try to figure out what we might be able to learn from the history of that plot. So we pulled the land surveyor field notes that John Sentner surveyed in 1869, I believe. And here you can see section 16. We're the southwest quarter of section 16. And you can see in the upper right, it's described as second rate high rolling prairie and first rate high rolling prairie in the two descriptions. Next slide. We did, when we purchased the land, it came with an agricultural lease. So we had to see that agricultural lease through, and immediately worked with the landowner or the farmer to see if he would do no-till tillage instead of tillage to help preserve the land and minimize the erosion. Next slide. And we were busy. We were looking for clues on the landscape as to what we could possibly find. We were hoping to find native vegetation, and in and amongst the reed canary grass, indeed, we did find some native sedges. Next slide. And we looked around even more, and there were more native sedges. Next slide. And here and there were some tiny, tiny areas of remnant vegetation. This was less than 1/10 of an acre, but we could see a glimmer here and there. This is one of those steep, seeded down hills that we saw in the aerial photograph. And there were some native plants there, and we were just so delighted. Next slide. And we continued our investigation into the farm and found all sorts of archaeological things. Next slide. And I can't read the slide on the left because I have these windows here, but I hope the rest of you can see what our archaeological digs came up with. A multitude of refrigerators, a multitude of cars, a multitude of mattresses, TVs, all sorts of things were in those ditches. This kitchen sink that I hauled out of the ditch has been turned into a bird bath. Next slide. So one of the other things that we began to do immediately, even with the agricultural lease, is we immediately went to seed down these contour buffer strips that you can see on the east side here. And we also seeded the vegetation along the filter, along the stream on the east side into filter strips. And this was pretty controversial. In 1999 and 2000, I had left the government for a number of years, and I wanted to seed these buffer strips into native vegetation. That was controversial at the time because I was told that they would erode, the hills were too steep, native vegetation was not going to work. And that might be true if you were only seeding switchgrass or one warm season grass, because the spring rains could impact those contour buffer strips from being stable. But what we did, and I received special permission, I had to sign many different forms saying that if it failed, I would pay it, on my own dime to reseed, because we did receive some cost share through a government program. And what we ended up doing is we got Carl Kurtz's Mesic Prairie seed mix, and we seeded it into these buffer strips. Next slide. And, our investigations continued in those areas to the north and east were pretty severe erosion sources. You can see my husband standing in one of the gullies coming right off of our neighbor to the north. And we, there's just not a lot of vegetation that's going to help hold that soil in place. So next slide. We did bite the bullet and create a dam crossing in order to trap the sediment. And my view in conservation has always been first move no soil, just like a doctor's oath is first do no harm, right? But the erosion was so massive that we just didn't have any other option but to catch the sediment. Next slide. And you can see the seeded down buffer strips up ahead, and we continued to burn the buffer strips to learn more about how our restoration efforts were going to help us with weed control. And next slide. We had friends like Carl Kurtz who provided lots and lots of guidance. I went and to every single Society of Ecological Restoration talk and conference that I could. I went to many Tallgrass Prairie Center prairie walks and training sessions that were led by Laura Jackson, who actually provided just some insights that helped us make some decisions and move forward with our process, because, it was directly inspired by some of the work from Laura Jackson, using mowing instead of chemical treatments to reestablish prairie. And so we made the hard decision not to continue farming the land. The erosion was just too severe. we wanted to seed everything down and just let the land heal. Next slide. And with our prescribed burning, this is what we got. This is a really wonderful field of bird's foot trefoil. The best crop of bird's foot trefoil that I've ever seen in my life. And, you know, it's a non-native legume. And while dairy and cattle farmers really, really love this species, in prairie restoration, it can be an issue. And I wasn't particularly happy about that, but we bit off the task that we were going to do this restoration without using any chemicals after the farming ceased. So we continued our path of research and trial and error. Next slide. And we seeded a variety of different species, including some early successional species like this rigid goldenrod. And in very, very short time frame of only a year, the vegetation was popping up like crazy. And especially in September of the year, the ground was reverberating with bumblebees humming. It's a sound I'd never heard before. Next slide. And so you can see our buffer strips were coming on pretty nice. They were beginning to get more diverse. This is one of the original Carl Kurtz's buffer strips. Next slide. And here's another view of such a buffer strip. And the vegetation off to the left of the screen isn't farmland anymore. We let the field actually go fallow 1 year before we seeded into the vegetation there. And those original buffer strips from Carl Kurtz's seed mix, after 4 years of having them seeded, we recorded over 85 different native plant species in those buffer strips, and none of them washed out. And we, from our observation, you know, the key was that Carl Kurtz's seed mix that we utilized was so rich in C3 forbs in wildflowers that those wildflowers emerged early in the spring. It also had early successional plants like Rudbeckia hirta, and those plants, along with some grasses like Canada wild rye, really served to stabilize those buffer strips, even though they were in D and E and F slopes, really steep terrain for Iowa. Next slide. And we began to see, you know, evidence of life coming back. There were turkey eggs, and next slide. And more sedges. Here's Carex molesta, and next slide. And, you know, we took some of those training sessions from Laura Jackson to heart and took our mowing extremely seriously. Next slide. And you can see here the original buffer strip going in. This is an older photograph. It shows how those buffer strips came across and divided the cropland. This is a slight bit out of sequence. Next slide. And I just wanted to show this photo where we just had such a struggle with our crop ground that we never looked back after we decided not to continue cropping. Next slide. And so we continued burning. You can see here the smooth brome. We burned and burned, and next slide. While the area that was cropland was coming up with native vegetation, like this compass plant shows here, that was seeded in the crop area, we continued, next slide, to struggle a little bit with the brome. We were hoping that our burning would show us some more prairie remnants on that pasture land on the east side. It did not. Our burning did end up causing the brome to not thrive like it would under a fertilized regime. And we could begin to see some weedy vegetation moving in, like that ragweed that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen, and the Lactuca cereola that you're seeing in the middle of the screen there. Next slide. And here's a really good picture of some of the ambrosia that we were seeing. Next slide. And then we had other surprises in our restoration efforts. Join us in our attempt to restore this tallgrass prairie. Next slide. And the vegetation continued to evolve. We were seeing areas that had been seeded go from this early successional vegetation complex that you see here with the rigid goldenrod and the Canada wild rye. You begin to see big blue stem popping out of that. Next slide. And, you know, eventually that vegetation really developed into more mid-successional species like the Illinois tick trefoil and the yellow coneflower and the rattlesnake master and the big blue stem that you're seeing in this slide. I think you're also seeing some prairie bush clover there. Next slide. And so we continued our burning efforts, our mowing efforts, and our weeding efforts. Next slide. And continued the exploration of this quarter section of land. Next slide. And there was lots of fun to be had within the work of the mowing and everything else. There was a lot of discoveries and a lot of fun to be had. Next slide. And we also begin to harvest our own seed from our restoration efforts. So this would be approximately 2009. So we really started our wholehearted seeding effort around 2002, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Next slide. And we discovered all sorts of critters and snakes. Next slide. The creeks were full of life and full of discoveries as well. Next slide. But we continue to have these erosion issues. So next slide. You can see here that the dam that we implemented in the north east corner of our farm was catching quite a bit erosional deposition, but we were getting erosional deposition from the other sources as well. You can also see from this aerial view, the east side, even though it's all seeded down, you can still see that crop footprint, and the west side, you can see has remained seeded down. Next slide. So this is some of our early happy occasions. We were really pleased to develop a all native legume food plot, and that seemed to be thriving with our burn regime. Next slide. And the work of weeding and chopping and just getting a handle on some of our non-native species just continued. Next slide. And we used everything from weed whackers to machetes to mowers to bush hog mowers. Every single tool that you can think of, we used. And actually my favorite is this machete because it's not as loud as the weed whacker, and you can enjoy the sounds of the prairie as you're going through it with your machete much better. Next slide. And the mowing really proved to be just a huge help for us. This breaks every child labor law and OSHA law that you're seeing right now, but mowing was really a critical piece to our puzzle. Next slide. And we began to just see wonderful wise friends like the compass plant, and it just was so uplifting to see some of these later successional plant species bloom and thrive and do really well. You're also seeing a fire break here that we have mowed in. Next slide. And the big blue stem was coming on just incredibly well. I remember Laura, going to a field day that Laura was leading, and she was talking about how effective mowing can be when you're seeding into pasture vegetation, and that it can be successful. So I had that success in my brain when we did just that. We seeded tall grass, prairie grasses into smooth brome and reed canary grass. And in the back of my head, I always had, Laura said, this is going to work. She said it's going to work. We just need to keep mowing. And so that's what we did. And here it was. Next slide. And in and among the smooth brome, we began to see a glimmer of hope. Here is Ruellia humilis that I had collected years earlier, and I had just broadcasted out into the pasture, right into the smooth brome. Next slide. And we also saw treats like this, walking the land and being out in the prairie. You just have these just wonderful, sweet moments. Next slide. And more nests were found and grassland bird eggs. Next slide. And we also were subject to a dragonfly migration. Those aren't little helicopters. Those are lots and lots of dragonflies in the sky. I'd never seen anything like that. Next slide. And we began to see more and more native vegetation come up in our smooth brome pasture. Next slide. And the other thing that we were just awestruck by with these incredible ant mounds. They were huge. They were 3 to 4 feet in diameter and 2 to 3 feet high, just these huge, gigundous ant mounds. Next slide. And here's just the earth in one of those ant mounds, really amazing. Next slide. And what we found, because we did burn quite often, many years we burned annually, some years we burned every other year. It was just kind of the luck of the draw, what we could and couldn't pull off. Burning was and is a critical component that allows us to retain our organic certification, because otherwise we just wouldn't be able to stay ahead of the weedy shrubs and other non-native species. But what we did find is that our frequent burn regime caused some very large patches to go unburned throughout our burn area. So we had many, many refugia, even though we burned very often, and we always made a point and have continued to not light those skips that we get when we do our burns. Next slide. And more native vegetation just has begun to surround us at our farm. Next slide. Here you see lead plant and white wild indigo, along with some goldenrod. Next slide. And butterfly milkweed with some little blue stem. Next slide. Here's some more Canada wild rye. It's persisted out in the areas where we originally seeded it, and it is not as thick, but you can still find it. It's just taken the background to the other vegetation that's come along. Next slide. And we continue our archaeological digs and come up with all sorts of treasures. Next slide. And are just awestruck by the amount of insects and butterflies and wildlife that we have the privilege to share this farm with. Next slide. I wanted to show you a few of my transects that I put out when we were beginning the process of trying to find remnant vegetation in our smooth brome pasture. So most of our transects looked a lot like this when we began. Next slide. And like this, you know, just basically smooth brome. There was some Kentucky bluegrass. There was, you know, some fescue, but really largely smooth brome, bluegrass, and fescue. Next slide. With our increased and continued burning, we saw ambrosia come in and some weedy asters. Next slide. And here you can see the weedy asters. You can see a little bit of the tick trefoil as well. Next slide. Would you go back to the 2005 slide? Thank you so much. When we began to see these transects with the smooth brome visibly becoming more diminutive in stature, with aster-pilosis, weedy asters, ambrosia coming into those areas, we took a deep breath and said, okay, we're going to seed into this smooth brome now. We purchased seed from John Jetson because the west side of our farm is a lot drier, a lot hillier, and we wanted different kind of seed as well. And I had been seed collecting over the years from ditches and railroad remnants and other areas. And so, you know, we had been doing some interseeding here and there, but we bit off a big one and decided we are going to now seed into our smooth brome area. And this is what the ground looked like when we seeded into it. And we did that after a spring burn in March. We just went out with our pickup truck and by hand broadcast the seed right into the area that was burned. Next slide. And this is what we were seeing. So this was seeded in 2006. And here you can see how our transects just became full of native vegetation. It was absolutely crazy to see. And I still think, you know, it had a lot to do with the seed that we got from John Jetson. Had so many native legumes in it. It was so rich in native legumes that it was the right time to seed. And it was the right mixture of species with many, many native legumes. Next slide. You can see the legumes, you know, even though partridge pea is an annual, it persists so nicely out on the prairie. You can also see Echinacea pallida coming in there and some sunflower species coming in there. Next slide. And here you can see, this is a fire break that we have on our very west part of our farm. And we continue to mow that fire break so that we just are able to control this fire. The fire that comes up from the east to the top of the hill on the west is very, very hot with this native vegetation. and it's difficult to maintain. So I didn't want to seed the prairie into the smooth brome there, but you can see it's just spilling out into the smooth brome. It is not going to be contained. The prairie is marching through the smooth brome. Next slide. And here you can see this is a picture from 2018. You see all of these different native legumes, the lead plant. You do see a little bit of persistence of the bird's foot trefoil. You see the little blue stem, side oats grama. You're seeing white wild indigo. There's rattlesnake master out there, several different species of Desmodium, Lespedeza capitata, lots of prairie clover. The list goes on, many different native legumes. Next slide. And you can also see, if you look at our prairie here, that we really don't have a lot of rough dogwood in it. But look further up the screen, and that's our neighbor to the south, and you see that whole invasion of rough dogwood coming in. Because we don't use chemicals, it's really key for us to keep that rough dogwood at bay, and our fire regime allows us to do that. Next slide. Here you see some more of the native legumes, white prairie clover. Next slide. And just a different angle showing more of this native vegetation, along with a little bit of bird's foot trefoil in our prairie. Next slide. Here's just the white wild indigo in June is absolutely phenomenal. Even with the weevil pest, we have so much prairie indigo. It's just absolutely unbelievable. Next slide. And here's just a close-up of the vegetation. Next slide. And the sedges have persisted. Our whole reason for not wanting to use chemicals, because the only native vegetation, or nearly the only remnant native vegetation that we found when we did our initial investigations, were native sedges. And it's impossible to pick out native sedges when you're treating smooth brome. And we did not want to forsake the native sedges that have hung on in this parcel of land for so long. So we decided to not go the chemical route. Next slide. And it's been a very wonderful experience. Our daughter has thoroughly enjoyed this journey with us of tallgrass prairie restoration, more so than we ever had imagined. And we've learned a lot in the process. Next slide. And you can see an aerial photograph here, what our plot of land looks like today, and you can see it in the context of the surrounding landscape. I think that you can even see the prairie sage there on the left. Next slide. We do continue to have issues of erosion along our creek bank, and we really hope to get connected with a university or somebody to help put our heads together with them to see what can we come up with to deal with this extreme stream bank erosional process that in many areas the bank is 15 feet from the floodplain, and it's crazy. You can see here on the survey rod, you can see at least a foot of post-settlement sediment on top of the A horizon. The bottom of the rod shows where the A horizon is. Next slide. And here's just another view of the erosion in our stream banks because we receive very, very flashy, very flashy water in our creeks, especially in the spring. Next slide. But you know, in here you can see a yellow jumping crab spider capturing a sweat bee, and you know, it's the life and death of the prairie that just keeps us inspired and keeps us going. Next slide. And the unique constituents of the tallgrass prairie, the beauty and just the wonder that you have the opportunity to enjoy. Next slide. And the next slide. And so we continue burning. It's a very important part of what we do for our weed maintenance. Next slide. And our daughter has fully embraced the firebug. Next slide. It's just been a very important tool in our toolbox in our tallgrass prairie restoration journey. Next slide. And the friends, you know, that come to enjoy the prairie with us are help make it all the worthwhile to discover species and look at species with friends. Next slide. And to share and learn together, to have people visit and see what their thoughts are. Next slide. And of course, to take a break and just enjoy the sun and enjoy the sounds of the tallgrass prairie is very important too. Next slide. And we continue to plant. Next slide. You know, this is in the context of my work has taken me to some pretty incredible places. This is Crater Lake in Oregon. Next slide. Tallgrass Prairie Center in Kansas, National Preserve. Here's Padre Island, Tallgrass Prairie in South Texas. Next slide. Yosemite National Park in California. But go ahead, next slide. But it's the tallgrass prairie ecosystem and its incredible rarity anymore, and its incredible importance to in terms of ecosystem services that keeps us, my family, my husband, my daughter, keeps us engaged and wanting to continue this restoration effort. Next slide. And the important function that tallgrass prairie has in a state like Iowa, where water quality can be such an issue, it is just a beacon of hope. So it keeps us inspired to keep going. Next slide. And you all inspire us, like Andy Olson coming out and Laura Walters, and learning from other people that are certified organic growers that are trying to learn, you know, how to manage vegetation and weeds and share their stories. Next slide. And of course, it's the inhabitants of the tallgrass prairie, you know, the unsung heroes that work so hard to keep our plants going and vegetation going, our food on the table. To have a place of refuge for our unsung hero pollinators is really important to us. Next slide. And to watch, you know, the next generation come along and embrace the conservation stewardship of tallgrass prairie restoration is beyond anything we ever imagined when my husband and I took on this project in 1999. Next slide. And now this is the next phase for us. We are looking at hand harvesting, hand processing, and hand packaging our little individual seed packets that are certified organic tallgrass prairie seed. Next slide. And if you would just, can you click the play, Laura? I can't hear the sound. That's too bad. I hope somebody else can. I'm not sure if you were able to hear the sound of the birds. It's just, it's a multitude of song out on the prairie, and this sounds a little existential, but when you walk out onto this prairie ground, it's not hard like it used to be. It's soft under your feet, and it's almost like the land has a memory of what it wants to revert to. And it is really inspiring, and just brings us awe and wonder every time we work on the tallgrass prairie at our farm. Next slide. Oops. I think we're doing I think that might be it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share our story with you today.
Thank you, Chris. And like I said, I had the opportunity to come out there this summer, and it really is just a wonderful place. So thank you for sharing your story. I find it very inspirational, what you do. So feel free to throw some questions in chat if anybody has them. One question we do have right now is, how do you decide which trees to leave and which to get rid of?
You know, we actually, because of the methods we employ, the mowing and the prescribed fire, actually it sorts itself out. We have not had to remove trees. We've had oak seedlings come on and grow into oaks within our fire regime. But we really have not had to hand remove any tree species. We did do some work in our creek to remove some non-native honeysuckle and just try to bring light into the creek banks. And that's really all that we've done.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If I were to try and do something like this and use fire and mowing as my primary sort of management technique, especially for fire, do you have any tips or resources people should look for to kind of get started with that? I know it can be very scary to do prescribed burns, especially at that scale.
It can. And I have to say that when I was young in the 90s, I started the first Burn for Hire program in Iowa. So I did many, many, many prescribed burns. And what I did was I taught people how to do prescribed burns on their own land. So it's not something to do lightly without training. So the first thing is get some training, go to some prescribed burn classes so you become comfortable with how a prescribed burn is done. And you learn about how to implement a prescribed burn plan. That's really key, is to have a very good plan, to have very good fire breaks, resources for that. I think there's some awesome resources with Pheasants Forever. There might be some resources with the Tallgrass Prairie Center. There used to be, I think. So you might want to talk about that a little bit. Some soil and water conservation districts have fire equipment that they lend out, and some conservation boards have fire equipment that they lend out. but I really do encourage people to get lots of training, have lots of helpers, and have motorized water and a lot of equipment on site.
Excellent. Yeah. And we do have some very good videos that Daryl Smith is the narrator of. So that's on our end, something to check out. Another question, do you graze the prairie in any capacity? And have you done any measurement of like soil carbon increases or things like that?
Wonderful questions. No, we did have cattle when we first took on the Prairie, the Burtal Farm project. But we ended up also stopping the cattle contract because there was just so much erosion going on. So now we're in a better place. And as my husband and I get older, every burn gets harder to implement. It's just hard work. And you know, we usually it's just really hard work. And so when we retire, our hope is to introduce grazing as an alternate to prescribed burning, because we see a time where we are not going to have the energy to keep up with our prescribed burning like we have over the last 20 plus years. I have not measured the soil carbon, but I would invite anyone to come out, because the great thing about it is we have neighbors to our east and west that are doing different practices. And so we would have a really great comparison. And I would love to measure soil carbon.
Another question, or just a quick follow-up on that. Was the erosion during grazing pasture wide or in specific areas?
It was pasture wide. It was just really overgrazed, and it was you know, too many cows, too long, too intense. And the farmland was abused as well. And so this landscape has had 2 decades of healing, but as you can see from the erosion along our creeks, we're not there yet.
Another question, did you take advantage of any cost share like EQIP or CRP when you were doing that farm ground conversion aspect?
Yes, so I sure did. And most of the cost share that we undertook early on was through the CRP program. And then we have recently followed up with some EQIP cost share to remove the brush in our creek area.
Excellent. One more question about trees again.
Yeah.
Why are the red twig dogwoods bad for prairie?
You know, I wouldn't necessarily say they are bad for prairie, but they can invade prairie to the extent that it crowds out other vegetation. The rough, mainly the rough dogwood, not so much the red twig dogwood, in my experience, can be very, very invasive. And if you don't burn regularly, the dogwood gets so tall that the fire no longer goes through it and it's no longer effective to treat it.
My boss direct messaged me, said she has a question about mowing for you. So
Oh.
Lori, you want to unmute?
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
I fear you gave me far too much credit for
Oh, no.
any wisdom 20 years ago, because all we had were some experiments here on you know, at UNI. You know, 1 or 2 years of mowing, overseeding and mowing is not the same as wisdom or even knowledge. So I'm sure that your success had a lot to do with Carl Kurtz and John Judson and all of their an enormous amount of experience. So I'm just curious, because I can't remember very much of this now. So you were mowing to weaken the brome before you added seed, and then you were overseeding and then continuing to mow for several years before you let it before you let it go, because obviously if you kept mowing, it was just, you wouldn't see those beautiful. So was that the sequence, mow and then overseed and then mow for a couple more years?
Yeah, so in our filter strip areas where we had a lot of reed canary grass, we mowed. And then we no-till drilled the prairie seed into the mowed area. And then we kept mowing those areas for several years, 3 or 4 years. And the prairie just pushed through that reed canary grass and smooth brome. It was really crazy to see. But it was the mowing that really helped with that, and mowing it close to the ground and then no-till drilling into it. We just didn't want to disturb the ground that close to the creek.
Right.
And
right.
we were afraid to overseed into that area because of the reed canary grass. The other pasture areas we burned, and then we broadcast into those areas that were more upland and more steep.
Yeah. And then were they mowed as well, or just burned and overseeded?
Just burned and overseeded.
Because we
And
get a lot of, yeah.
And I think really the key was the incredible diversity of legumes that was in John Judson's seed mix.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you. You know, without you sitting on my shoulder saying this is going to work, we would not have had the courage to proceed on a lot of this.
Well, that's terrifying, because what if it had come out wrong? Yeah, what you've done is just spectacular. Such an inspiration, Chris. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think we're at the top of the hour, about done. We'll stop using your time, Chris. One quick question: where is your farm located, and where can people look for buying seed from you, from your business?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question. You can find us on Etsy at Burtal Farm Seed. And, you know, it's not a big enterprise, but we sure are proud of it. Thank you for asking. I really appreciate that.
I'd like to add one thing, Andy, if we have a moment. A lot of us woke up this morning to the news that the Belleville Prairie in Rockford, Illinois had been destroyed. And it was not a good morning, but I just want to say, Chris, you've given me hope,
Oh, how
and
sweet.
given a lot of us at the TPC hope with what you're
Oh,
doing. So thank you so much.
thank you. You're going to make me cry.
No, you totally deserve it.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you everybody for showing up today and for your time. We really appreciate it. So
If you have any additional questions, let us know. We'll try and get them answered for you. Thank you, Chris.
Ciao.
bye, everybody.